On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine in a major escalation of the Russo-Ukrainian War, which began in 2014. The invasion has likely resulted in tens of thousands of deaths on both sides and caused Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II, with an estimated 8 million people being displaced within the country by late May as well as 7.8 million Ukrainians fleeing the country as of November 8, 2022. Within 5 weeks of the invasion, Russia experienced its greatest emigration since the 1917 October Revolution. The invasion has also caused global food shortages. Following the 2014 Ukrainian Revolution, Russia annexed Crimea, and Russian-backed paramilitaries seized part of the Donbas region of southeastern Ukraine, which consists of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, sparking a regional war. In March 2021, Russia began a large military build-up along its border with Ukraine, eventually amassing up to 190,000 troops and their equipment. Despite the build-up, denials of plans to invade or attack Ukraine were issued by various Russian government officials up to the day before the invasion. On February 21, 2022, Russia recognized the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, two self-proclaimed breakaway quasi-states in the Donbas. The next day, the Federation Council of Russia authorized the use of military force and Russian troops entered both territories. The invasion began on the morning of February 24, when Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation aiming for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. In his address, Putin espoused irredentist views, challenged Ukraine's right to statehood, and falsely claimed Ukraine was governed by neo-Nazis who persecuted the ethnic Russian minority. Minutes later, missiles, rockets and airstrikes hit across Ukraine, including the capital Kyiv, followed by a large ground invasion from multiple directions. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky enacted martial law and a general mobilization. Russian attacks were initially launched on a northern front from Belarus towards Kyiv, a northeastern front towards Kharkiv, a southern front from Crimea, and a southeastern front from Luhansk and Donetsk. Russia's advance towards Kyiv stalled in March, with Russian troops retreating from the northern front by April. On the southern and southeastern fronts, Russia captured Kherson in March and then Mariupol in May after a siege. On April 19, Russia launched a renewed attack on the Donbas region, with Luhansk Oblast fully captured by July 3. Russian forces continued to bomb both military and civilian targets far from the front line. Ukrainian forces launched counter-offensives in the south in August, and in the northeast in September, successfully recapturing the majority of Kharkiv Oblast. Soon after, Russia announced the illegal annexation of 4 partially occupied Ukrainian oblasts. In the course of the southern counter-offensive, Ukraine retook the city of Kherson in November. The invasion has received widespread international condemnation. The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution condemning the invasion and demanding a full withdrawal of Russian forces. The International Court of Justice ordered Russia to suspend military operations and the Council of Europe expelled Russia. Many countries imposed sanctions on Russia, as well as on its ally Belarus, which have affected the economies of Russia and the world, and provided humanitarian and military aid to Ukraine, totaling over $80 billion from 40 countries as of August 2022. Protests occurred around the world. Those in Russia were met with mass arrests and increased media censorship, including a ban on the words war and invasion. Over 1,000 companies have pulled out of Russia and Belarus in response to the invasion. The International Criminal Court has opened an investigation into crimes against humanity in Ukraine since 2013, including war crimes in the 2022 invasion. Background: following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine and Russia continued to retain close ties. In 1994, Ukraine agreed to abandon its nuclear arsenal and signed the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances on the condition that Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States issue an assurance against threats or use of force to the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine. 5 years later, Russia was one of the signatories of the Charter for European Security, where it reaffirmed the inherent right of each and every participating state to be free to choose or change its security arrangements, including treaties of alliance, as they evolve. Despite being recognized as an independent country since 1991, as a former USSR constituent republic, Ukraine was perceived by the leadership of Russia as part of its sphere of influence. In 2008, Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke out against Ukraine's membership in NATO. In 2009, Romanian analyst Iulian Cifu and his co-authors opined that in regard to Ukraine, Russia has pursued an updated version of the Brezhnev Doctrine, which dictates that the sovereignty of Ukraine cannot be larger than that of the Warsaw Pact's member states prior to the collapse of the Soviet sphere of influence during the late 1980s and early 1990s. This view is built upon the premise that Russia's actions to placate the West in the early 1990s should have been met with reciprocity from the West, without NATO expansion along Russia's border. Following weeks of protests as part of the Euromaidan movement, pro-Russian Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych and the leaders of the Ukrainian parliamentary opposition on February 21, 2014 signed a settlement agreement that called for an early election. The following day, Yanukovych fled from Kyiv ahead of an impeachment vote that stripped him of his powers as president. Leaders of the Russian-speaking eastern regions of Ukraine declared continuing loyalty to Yanukovych, causing the 2014 pro-Russian unrest in Ukraine. This unrest was fomented by Russia as part of a coordinated political and military campaign against Ukraine. Amidst that, Russia invaded and subsequently annexed Crimea in March 2014, followed by the war in Donbass, which started in April 2014 with the creation of the Russia-backed quasi-states of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. The Minsk agreements allowed the fighting to subside in Donbass, leaving separatists in control of about a third of the region. This stalemate led to the war being labeled a frozen conflict. Since 2019, Russia has issued over 650,000 internal Russian passports among an unconfirmed overall population, which is considered by Ukrainian government as a step towards annexation of the region. On September 14, 2020, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky approved Ukraine's new national security strategy, which provides for the development of the distinctive partnership with NATO with the aim of membership in NATO. On March 24, 2021, Zelensky signed the Decree No. 117/2021 approving the strategy of de-occupation and reintegration of the temporarily occupied territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, complementing the activities of the Crimean Platform. Putin's close advisor Nikolai Patrushev was a leading figure behind Russia's updated national security strategy, published in May 2021. It states that Russia may use forceful methods to thwart or avert unfriendly actions that threaten the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. In July 2021, Putin published an essay titled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, in which he reaffirmed his view that Russians and Ukrainians were one people. American historian Timothy Snyder described Putin's ideas as imperialism. British journalist Edward Lucas described it as historical revisionism. Other observers have noted that the Russian leadership has a distorted view of modern Ukraine and its history. Russia has said that a possible Ukrainian accession to NATO and the NATO enlargement in general threaten its national security. In turn, Ukraine and other European countries neighboring Russia have accused Putin of attempting to restore the Russian Empire/Soviet Union and of pursuing aggressive militaristic policies. Initial tensions. None. First Russian military buildup. On February 21, 2021, the Russian Defense Ministry announced the deployment of 3,000 paratroopers to the border for large-scale exercises. The announcement was made following the Ukrainian government's crackdown on Viktor Medvedchuk earlier that month. Medvedchuk was a leading pro-Russian Ukrainian opposition politician and tycoon with close personal ties to Vladimir Putin. An analysis by Time published in February 2022 cited the event as the start of the Russian military buildup near Ukraine. On March 3, Suspiln claimed separatists from the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic reported they had been granted permission to use preemptive fire for destruction on Ukrainian military positions. On March 16, the SBGS border patrol in Sumy spotted a Russian Mi-8 helicopter trespassing approximately 50 meters into Ukrainian territory before heading back to Russian airspace. 10 days later, Russian troops fired mortars at Ukrainian positions near the village of Shumy in Donbass, killing 4 Ukrainian servicemen. Russia refused to renew the ceasefire in Donbass on 1 April. Beginning from March 16, NATO began a series of military exercises known as Defender Europe 2021. The military exercise, one of the largest NATO-led military exercises in Europe for decades, included near-simultaneous operations across over 30 training areas in 12 countries, involving 28,000 troops from 27 nations. Russia criticized NATO for holding Defender Europe 2021, and deployed troops to its western borders for military exercises in response to NATO's military activities. The deployment led to Russia having a sizable troop buildup along the Russo-Ukrainian border by mid-April. A Ukrainian estimation placed the deployment at 40,000 Russian forces for Crimea and the eastern portion of the Russo-Ukrainian border. The German government subsequently condemned the deployment as an act of provocation. On March 24, Zelensky announced Ukraine's intent to take back Crimea, mentioning among others military means. The next day Russia sent troops to the Ukraine border. On March 30, Colonel General Ruslan Kamchuk, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, revealed intelligence reports suggesting a military buildup by the Russian armed forces on the outskirts of Ukraine in preparations for the Zapad 2021. 28 Russian battalion tactical groups were situated along the Russo-Ukrainian border, primarily at Crimea, Rostov, Bryansk, and Voronezh. It was estimated that 60,700 Russian troops were stationed at Crimea and Donbass, with 2,000 military advisors and instructors in eastern Ukraine alone. According to Kamchuk, the buildup, expected to increase to 53 battalion tactical groups, posed a threat to the military security of Ukraine. Dmitry Peskov, a spokesman for Vladimir Putin, disagreed with the Ukrainian statements, claiming the military movements are not of any concern for neighboring countries. Instead, the decisions were made to deal on matters of national security. Between late March and early April 2021, significant quantities of weapons and equipment from various regions of Russia, including as far away as Siberia, were transported towards the Russo-Ukrainian border and into Crimea. Unofficial Russian sources, such as the pro-Russian Telegram channel Military Observer, published a video of the flight of a group of Russian Kamov Ka-52 and Mi-28 attack helicopters. It was emphasized by the original sources that the flight had allegedly taken place on the Russo-Ukrainian border. Continued violence and escalation. Russian and pro-Kremlin media alleged on April 3, 2021 that a Ukrainian drone attack had caused the death of a child in the Russian-occupied part of Donbass. However, no further details were given surrounding the incident. Vyacheslav Volodin, Speaker of the Russian State Duma, believed that Ukrainian leaders should be held responsible for the death, while proposing to exclude Ukraine from the Council of Europe. On April 5, Ukrainian representatives of the Joint Center of Control and Coordination sent a note to the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine regarding pro-Russian intentions to falsify the accusations. The next day, the mission confirmed the death of a child in Russian-occupied Donbass but failed to establish a link between the purported Ukrainian drone strike and the child's death. On April 6, 2021, a Ukrainian serviceman was killed as a result of shelling of Ukrainian positions near the town of Nevelsk in Donetsk. Another soldier was killed near Stepny by an unknown explosive device. As a result of the shelling, the water pumping station in the gray zone between the villages of Vasilivka and Kruta Baka in South Donbass was de-energized, cutting off the water supply to over 50 settlements. Shortly after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Ukraine blocked the flow of the northern Crimean Canal, which had supplied 85% of Crimea's water. Crimea's reservoirs were subsequently depleted and water shortages ensued, with water reportedly only being available for 3 to 5 hours a day in 2021. The New York Times has cited senior American officials mentioning securing Crimea's water supply could be an objective of a possible incursion by Russia. Russia moved ships between the Caspian Sea and Black Sea. The transfer included several landing craft and artillery boats. Interfax reported on April 8 that the crews and ships of the Caspian Flotilla would perform the final naval exercises in cooperation with the Black Sea Fleet. On April 10, 2021, Ukraine invoked paragraph 16 of the Vienna document and initiated a meeting in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe on the surge of Russian troops near the Russo-Ukrainian border and Russian-occupied Crimea. Ukraine's initiative was supported by several countries, but the Russian delegation failed to appear at the meeting and refused to provide explanations. On April 13, 2021, Ukrainian consul Alexander Sosanyuk was detained in St. Petersburg by the Federal Security Service, allegedly while receiving confidential information during a meeting with a Russian citizen. Sosanyuk was later expelled from Russia. In response, Yevhen Chernikov, a senior Russian diplomat of the Russian embassy in Kyiv, was declared a persona non grata on April 19 in Ukraine and was forced to leave the country within 72 hours. On April 14, 2021, in a meeting in Crimea, Nikolai Patrushev, Secretary of the Security Council of Russia, accused Ukrainian special services of trying to organize terrorist attacks and sabotage on the peninsula. On the night of 14 to April 15, 2021, a naval confrontation took place in the Sea of Azov, 40 kilometers from the Kerch Strait, between 3 Ukrainian Gyurza M-class artillery boats and 6 vessels from the Coast Guard of the Border Service of the FSB. The Ukrainian artillery boats were escorting civilian ships when the incident occurred. It was reported that Ukrainian ships threatened to use airborne weapons to deter provocations from FSB vessels. The incident ended without any casualties. The following day, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine reported that Russia had announced the closure of parts of the Black Sea to warships and vessels of other countries until October, under the pretext of military exercises. The ministry condemned the decision as a gross violation of the right of navigational freedoms guaranteed by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. According to the convention, Russia must not obstruct maritime passages of the international strait to ports in the Sea of Azov. According to John Kirby, Pentagon press secretary, Russia had concentrated more troops near the Russo-Ukrainian border than in 2014. Russia reportedly imposed temporary restrictions on flights over parts of Crimea and the Black Sea from 20 to April 24, 2021, as stated in an international report for pilots. On April 22, 2021, Russian Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu announced a drawdown of military exercises with troops from the 58th and 41st Army, and the 7th, 76th, and 98th Guards Airborne Division returning to their permanent bases by May 1 after inspections in the southern and western military districts. Equipment at the Pogonovo training facility was to remain for the annual military exercise with Belarus scheduled in September 2021. Senior officials of the U.S. Department of Defense reported on May 5, 2021 that Russia had only withdrawn a few thousand troops since the previous military buildup. Despite withdrawals of several Russian units back to their native barracks, vehicles and equipment were not withdrawn, leading to fears that a redeployment might occur. Senior U.S. Defense Department officials in early May estimated over 80,000 Russian troops still remained at the Russo-Ukrainian border. Renewed tensions. None. Second Russian military buildup. November SPAN and NBSP, /SPAN 2021 and NBSP, and N- number 32, December 2021. None. January SPAN and NBSP, /SPAN 2022. None. February SPAN and NBSP, /SPAN 2022. None. Alleged Russian subversion attempts. On November 26, 2021, Zelensky accused the Russian government and Ukrainian billionaire Rinat Akhmetov of backing a plan to overthrow the Ukrainian government. Russia subsequently denied the claims. On January 10, 2022, the SBU announced that it had arrested a Russian military intelligence agent who was attempting to recruit operatives to conduct attacks at Odessa. 3 days later, Ukraine was struck by a cyber attack that affected the official websites of several Ukrainian government ministries. It was later suspected that Russian hackers might be responsible for the incident. The Hermau accused Russian special services of preparing provocations against Russian soldiers stationed at Transnistria, a breakaway unrecognized state internationally considered part of Moldova, to create a casus belli for a Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Biden administration later revealed that the Russian government deployed Russian operatives, trained in urban warfare and explosives, as saboteurs to stage a fabricated attack against Russian proxy separatists at eastern Ukraine, to provide Russia with another pretext for an invasion. The Russian government denied the claims. On January 22, 2022, the British government said Russia was preparing a plan to overthrow Ukraine's government via military force and install a pro-Russian puppet administration in the country, potentially led by Yevgeny Murayev, a former member of the Ukrainian parliament. Both Murayev and the Russian government denied the allegations, with the latter blaming NATO member states led by the Anglo-Saxons for the crisis. On February 3, the US said that Russia was planning to use a fabricated video showing a staged Ukrainian attack as a pretext for a further invasion of Ukraine. The Russian government denied any plans to orchestrate a pretext for an invasion. US intelligence sources warned in mid-February that Russia had compiled lists of Ukrainian political figures and other prominent individuals to be targeted for either arrest or assassination in the event of an invasion. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva, Bathsheba Nell Crocker, wrote to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, saying the U.S. has credible information that indicates Russian forces are creating lists of identified Ukrainians to be killed or sent to camps following a military occupation, and that Russia will likely use lethal measures to disperse peaceful protests from civilian populations. Russia's accusations of genocide in eastern Ukraine. Ukrainian defenses. In preparation for a possible renewed Russian invasion, the Ukrainian ground forces announced a meeting in April 2021 regarding territorial defenses to strengthen and protect the nation's borders and critical facilities, and to combat sabotage and reconnaissance groups in southern Ukraine. During the same month, Zelensky visited Ukrainian defensive positions in Donbas. According to Russia, Ukraine deployed 125,000 troops to the Donbas conflict zone in December 2021. The United States estimated in December 2021 that Russia could assemble over 175,000 troops to invade Ukraine. Alexei Reznikov, Ukrainian Minister of Defense, stated that we have 250,000 official members of our army. Plus, I said 400,000 veterans and 200,000 reservists. 175,000 not enough to go to Ukraine. Reznikov claimed that Russia could launch a large-scale attack on Ukraine in late January 2022. Ukraine's territorial defense forces recruited additional citizens and trained them in urban guerrilla tactics and firearms use. Such insurgency tactics, as reported by the New York Times, could support a resistance movement if the Russian military were able to overwhelm the Ukrainian military. Andriy Zahorodniuk, former Ukrainian Minister of Defense, wrote in January that in the case of a Russian invasion, the Russian forces would likely destroy key elements of the country's military infrastructure and will be able to advance deep into Ukrainian territory, but would face difficulty in securing it. Zahorodniuk further stated, Russian occupation forces will face highly motivated opponents fighting in familiar surroundings. Foreign support. NATO reinforcements. The Dutch and Spanish governments deployed forces to the region in support of NATO. On January 20, 2022, Spanish Defense Minister, Margarita Robles announced that the Spanish Navy was being deployed to the Black Sea. The patrol vessel Meteoro, acting as a minesweeper, was already en route and the frigate Blast Alezo departed on January 22. She announced that the Spanish government was considering deploying the Spanish Air Force to Bulgaria. 4 Eurofighters were deployed on February 12. The Netherlands said it would send 2 F-35s to Bulgaria as part of NATO's expanded air surveillance mission. On February 5, 2022, the first of 2,000 newly deployed U.S. soldiers to Europe arrived in Germany and Poland, as part of the U.S. attempt to bolster NATO's eastern flank as Russia deploys more forces along Ukraine's borders. On February 7, 2022, Johnson said Britain would not flinch as he prepared to deploy Royal Marines, RAF aircraft, and Royal Navy warships to Eastern Europe. On February 11, 2022, the U.S. announced an additional deployment of 3,000 troops to Poland and sent F-15 jets to Romania. Escalation and invasion. None. Alleged clashes between Russia and Ukraine. Fighting in Donbass escalated significantly on February 17, 2022. There was a sharp increase in artillery shelling by the Russian-led militants in Donbass, which was considered by Ukraine and its allies to be an attempt to provoke the Ukrainian army or create a pretext for invasion. While the daily number of attacks over the first 6 weeks of 2022 was 2 to 5, the Ukrainian military reported 60 attacks on February 17. Russian state media also reported over 20 artillery attacks on separatist positions the same day. Russian separatists shelled a kindergarten at Stanisaya Luhanska using artillery, injuring 3 civilians. The Luhansk People's Republic said that its forces had been attacked by the Ukrainian government with mortars, grenade launchers, and machine gun fire. On February 18, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic ordered emergency mandatory evacuations of civilians from their respective capital cities, although it has been noted that full evacuations would take months to accomplish. A BBC analysis found that the video announcing the emergency evacuation had been filmed 2 days prior to its purported date, indicated by its metadata. Russian state media also reported a car bombing, allegedly targeting the separatist government headquarters in Donetsk. On February 21, 2022, Russia's Federal Security Service said that Ukrainian shelling had destroyed an FSB border facility 150 m from the Russia-Ukraine border in Rostov Oblast. Separately, the press service of the Southern Military District said that Russian forces had in the morning that day killed a group of 5 saboteurs near the village of Mityakinskaya, Rostov Oblast, that had penetrated the border from Ukraine in 2 infantry fighting vehicles, the vehicles having been destroyed. Ukraine denied being involved in both incidents and called them a false flag. Additionally, 2 Ukrainian soldiers and a civilian were reported killed by shelling in the village of Zaitsev, 30 kilometers north of Donetsk. Several analysts, including the investigative website Bellingcat, published evidence that many of the claimed attacks, explosions as well as evacuations in Donbass were staged by Russia. On February 21, 2022, the Luhansk thermal power plant in the Luhansk region, close to the contact line, was shelled by unknown forces. The Ukrainian news agency said that it was forced to shut down as a result. Recognition of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics by Russia. On January 21, 2022, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation announced on Pravda that its deputies would introduce a non-binding resolution in the State Duma to ask President Putin to officially recognize the breakaway Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. The resolution was adopted by the State Duma on February 15, 2022 in a 351-16 vote, with one abstention. It was supported by United Russia, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, A Just Russia, For Truth and the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, but was opposed by the New People Party. On February 21, 2022, the leaders of the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, respectively Denis Pushilin and Leonid Pasiknik, requested that President Putin officially recognize the republic's independence. Both leaders also proposed signing a treaty on friendship and cooperation with Russia, including on military cooperation. Concluding the extraordinary session of the Security Council of Russia held on that day, Putin said that the decision on recognition thereof would be taken that day. The request was endorsed by Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu. Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin said the government had been laying the groundwork for such move for many months already. Later that day, Putin signed decrees of recognition of the republics. Additionally, treaties on friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance between Russia and the republics were inked. Putin's denial of Ukrainian statehood. International sanctions on Russia. In response to the recognition of the two breakaway republics, Western countries rolled out sanctions against Russia. On February 22, 2022, UK Prime Minister Johnson announced sanctions on 5 Russian banks, namely Rossiya Bank, Industrialny Sberegatelny Bank, General Bank, Promsvyaze Bank, and Black Sea Bank, and 3 billionaire associates of Putin, namely Gennady Timchenko, Boris Romanovich Rotenberg, and Igor Rotenberg. German Chancellor Scholz announced a halt to the certification process of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. EU foreign ministers blacklisted all members of the Russian Duma who voted in favor of the recognition of the breakaway regions, banned EU investors from trading in Russian state bonds, and targeted imports and exports with separatist entities. U.S. President Biden announced sanctions on banks VEB.RF and Promsvyaze Bank and comprehensive sanctions on Russia's sovereign debt. Invasion. On February 21, 2022, following the recognition of the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, President Putin ordered additional Russian troops into Donbass, in what Russia called a peacekeeping mission. Later on the same day, several independent media outlets confirmed that Russian forces were entering Donbass. On February 22, 2022, the United States declared this movement an invasion. On the same day, the Federation Council unanimously authorized Putin to use military force outside Russia. Ukrainian President Zelensky ordered reservists called up, while not committing to general mobilization yet. On February 23, 2022, an unidentified senior U.S. defense official was quoted by news media as saying that 80% of Russian forces assigned in a raid along Ukraine's border were ready for battle and that a ground incursion could commence at any moment. On the same day, the Ukrainian parliament approved the decree of President Volodymyr Zelensky on the introduction of a state of emergency from midnight on February 24, 2022 across the territory of all Ukraine, except Donetsk and Luhansk regions, for a period of 30 days. The Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs recommended that Ukrainian citizens refrain from travel to Russia and those living in Russia leave the country immediately. At about 4 a.m. Moscow time on February 24, 2022, President Putin announced the beginning of a special military operation in the Donbas region. Shortly after, reports of big explosions came from multiple cities in central and eastern Ukraine, including Kyiv and Kharkiv. The U.S. was swift to announce that it would not send U.S. combat troops into Ukraine to intervene militarily. The U.S. repeated its commitment not to send ground troops into Ukraine for fear of provoking war between the United States and Russia. Many observers believed that Russian military operations in Ukraine would inevitably lead to the capitulation of the Ukrainian government and end to the country's national sovereignty. This proved to be untrue. Diplomatic negotiations. Between 2 and November 3, 2021, CIA Director William Burns met with senior Russian intelligence officials in Moscow to convey to the Kremlin Biden's concern about the situation on the Russo-Ukrainian border. CNN reported that Burns spoke by phone with Zelensky following the meeting in Moscow. Simultaneously, a high-ranking U.S. Department of State official was dispatched to Ukraine. On November 15, acting German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas and French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian expressed concern in a joint communiqué about Russian movements of troops and hardware near Ukraine, calling on both sides to adopt and maintain a posture of restraint. At the same time, Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby confirmed that the United States continued to observe unusual military activity by Russia near the Russo-Ukrainian border. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken discussed reports of Russian military activity in the area with Le Drian. On November 16, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg told reporters that it was important NATO doesn't increase tensions, but we have to be clear-eyed. We need to be realistic about the challenges we face. Stoltenberg added that the alliance saw an unusual concentration of Russian forces, which Russia might be willing to use to conduct aggressive actions against Ukraine. In early November 2021, Ukrainian intelligence assessed the information about the transfer of additional Russian troops to the Ukrainian borders as an element of psychological pressure. A week later, the Office of the President of Ukraine acknowledged that Russia was building up specific groups of troops near the border. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba urged the French and German governments to prepare for a possible military scenario of Russia's actions against Ukraine. On November 15, Zelensky and the head of the European Council Charles Michel discussed the security situation along the borders of Ukraine. On the same day, Kuleba held talks on the same issues in Brussels. The new Ukrainian Defense Minister, Alexei Reznikov, went to Washington, D.C., where on November 18 he met with U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. On November 16, British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace visited Kyiv. Israel maintains a strong relationship with both Ukraine and Russia, and sometimes acts as an interlocutor between the two. In April 2021, Zelensky asked the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to mediate the situation between himself and Putin. Israel raised the idea with Russia, who declined. In a meeting at Kyiv in October with Zelensky, Israeli President Isaac Herzog told Zelensky that the new Israeli government under Prime Minister Naftali Bennett was willing to resume efforts at Ukrainian-Russian mediation. Bennett raised the idea in a meeting with Putin 2 weeks later at Sochi, but Putin declined. In late January, the United States was again discussing sanctions with European allies in case of a Russian invasion. Biden said the sanctions would be swift and severe, including a game-over strategy of targeting Russian banks, bond markets, and the assets of elites close to Putin. This approach was also criticized, and the proposed cut-off of Russian banks from the Visa, MasterCard, and SWIFT payment systems was withdrawn. The challenge for US and NATO vis-a-vis Russia is the creation of credible deterrence with a plan for a de-escalatory sequence, including a reduction in inflammatory rhetoric, Russian troop withdrawals from the Russo-Ukrainian border, renewed Donbas peace talks, as well as a temporary halt on military exercises at the Black and Baltic Seas by the US, NATO or Russia. A Normandy format meeting was planned between Russian, Ukrainian, German, and French senior officials at Paris on January 26, 2022. With a follow-up phone call between the French President Emmanuel Macron and Putin on January 28. Ukraine fulfilled Russia's condition for a meeting at Paris and decided to withdraw a controversial draft law on the reintegration of Crimea and Donbas from the Ukrainian parliament, as contradicting the Minsk peace agreements. On February 7, 2022, French President Emmanuel Macron met Vladimir Putin in Moscow, with mixed outcomes. Macron said that Putin told him that Russia will not further escalate the crisis. Putin scoffed at assertions that NATO is a defensive alliance and warned the Western countries that if Ukraine joined NATO and decided to take back Crimea using military means, European countries will automatically be in a military conflict with Russia. Putin promised Macron not to carry out new military initiatives near Ukraine. NATO-Russia security talks. On December 7, 2021, U.S. President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin talked via video conference. One of the topics discussed was the crisis over Ukraine, the Russian side issuing a statement that said Putin highlighted the fact that it was NATO that was undertaking dangerous attempts to develop Ukrainian territory and increase its potential along borders. He demanded reliable, legal guarantees that would preclude NATO from expanding its territory toward Russia or deploying its strike weapon systems in countries bordering Russia. On December 15, 2021, Russia formally handed over to the US its two draft treaties on security guarantees whereby the US as well as NATO would, among other things, undertake not to deploy troops in ex-Soviet states that were not NATO members, rule out any further expansion of the alliance eastward, undertake not to deploy any forces in other countries in addition to that which were deployed as of May 27, 1997, and refrain from conducting any military activity in Ukraine as well as in other states in Eastern Europe, the South Caucasus and Central Asia. Biden and Putin had a 50-minute phone call on December 30, 2021. In a White House statement released afterwards, on the call, Biden urged Putin to escalate tensions with Ukraine. According to Putin's aide, Biden told Putin that the US did not plan to deploy offensive weapons in Ukraine. Biden also warned that if Russia continued aggression against Ukraine, it would lead to serious costs and consequences such as the US imposing additional economic sanctions on Russia, increasing US military presence in the eastern members of NATO, and increased assistance to Ukraine. According to Putin's aide, Putin responded by saying that it would cause a total severance of relations between Russia and the US as well as the West at large. The following day, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov addressed the question about what Russia expected in response to its security guarantees proposals by saying that we will not allow anyone to drag out our initiatives in endless discussions. If a constructive response does not follow within a reasonable time and the West continues its aggressive course, Russia will be forced to take every necessary action to ensure a strategic balance and to eliminate unacceptable threats to our security. On January 10, 2022, the US and Russia held bilateral talks in Geneva, whose purpose had been defined by the two sides as to discuss concerns about their respective military activity and confront rising tensions over Ukraine. The talks were led by Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, and U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman. The Geneva meeting was followed by a meeting of the NATO-Russia Council in Brussels on January 12 that involved delegations from all 30 NATO countries and one from Russia to discuss the situation in and around Ukraine, and the implications for European security. The Russian MOD statement following the meeting stated that Russia brought Russian assessments of the current state in the field of Euro security, and also gave explanations on the military aspects of the Russian draft agreement on security guarantees. The talks were judged by Russia to be unsuccessful. Following the meeting, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said that, with respect to Ukraine's potential accession to NATO, all NATO allies were united on the core principle that each and every nation has the right to choose his own path and Russia doesn't have a veto on whether Ukraine can become a NATO member. At the end of the day, it has to be NATO allies and Ukraine that decides on membership. On January 21, 2022, Lavrov and Blinken met in Geneva. Blinken noted afterwards that the meeting was not a negotiation but a candid exchange of concerns and ideas. Following the meeting, Blinken said that the US had made clear to Russia that its renewed invasion would be met with swift, severe, and a united response from the United States and our partners and allies. The US delivered a formal written response to Russia's security demands on January 26, 2022. The response rejected Moscow's demand that NATO renounce its promise that Ukraine would be able to join NATO. Commenting on the content of the US response, Blinken said that the document included concerns of the United States and our allies and partners about Russia's actions that undermine security, a principled and pragmatic evaluation of the concerns that Russia has raised, and our own proposals for areas where we may be able to find common ground. On February 1, 2022, Putin said the US response had failed to address Moscow's three key demands, namely the non-expansion of NATO, refusal to deploy offensive weapon systems close to the Russian borders, and bringing back NATO's military infrastructure to the status quo of 1997. On February 17, as the risk of Russian invasion of Ukraine was being assessed by the US and NATO as very high, Russia handed a letter to the US ambassador that blamed Washington for having ignored its main security demands. United Nations Security Council. A UN Security Council meeting was convened on January 31, 2022 to discuss the ongoing crisis. Russia tried to block the meeting, but the request was rejected with 10 votes for the meeting to go ahead, 2 against and 3 abstentions. During the debate, the US and Russia exchanged accusations. The US ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, accused Russia of aggressive behavior, and posing a clear threat to international peace and security. She said Russia had made the largest military mobilization for decades in Europe, and was trying to paint Ukraine and Western countries as the aggressors to fabricate a pretext for attack. Russia's ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, accused the West of hysterics and of whipping up tensions over Ukraine. He accused the US of stoking the conflict and said the UNSC meeting was an attempt to drive a wedge between Russia and Ukraine. According to him, Ukraine was not abiding by the Minsk protocols of 2014 and 2015 to end the conflict with the separatists, and Western nations were pumping Ukraine full of weapons contrary to the Minsk protocols. Nebenzia added that Ukraine's violation of the Minsk protocols could end in the worst way. Ukrainian permanent representative at the UN Sergei Kyslytsya said Russia had deployed 112,000 troops near Ukraine's borders and in Crimea, with 18,000 deployed at sea off Ukraine's coast. China's permanent representative, Zhang Jun, said the meeting was counterproductive and quiet diplomacy, not megaphone diplomacy, was needed. No resolution was agreed at the meeting. Later, the February 21 intervention in Donbass was widely condemned by the UN Security Council, and did not receive any support. Kenya's ambassador, Martin Kimani, compared Putin's move to colonialism and said we must complete our recovery from the embers of dead empires in a way that does not plunge us back into new forms of domination and oppression. Another UN Security Council meeting was convened on 23–24 February 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine during this UN Security Council emergency meeting aiming to defuse the crisis. Secretary-General Antonio Guterres had stated, "Give peace a chance." Russia invaded while holding the presidency of the UN Security Council for February 2022, and has veto power as one of 5 permanent members. International treaties and negotiation structures. On December 15, 2021, Russia proposed documents that it referred to as draft treaties, which referred to multiple international agreements, including the Charter for European Security and the NATO-Russia Council. Responses from NATO and the US in January 2022 referred to NRC, the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, the United States-Russia Strategic Stability Dialogue, the Helsinki Final Act, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Normandy Format and other treaties and forums. On March 4, 2022, Russia informed Norway that it would be unable to attend Norway's Cold Response, a biennial exercise that involves 30,000 troops from 27 countries. Lavrov-EU correspondence. On the pan-European level, Lavrov sent separate letters to European Union and NATO countries on January 30, 2022, asking them not to strengthen their security at the expense of the security of others and demanding an individual reply from each. Even though the text repeatedly referred to the OSCE, not all OSCE members received the letters. A few days later, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and other EU leaders, asserting the common foreign and security policy, stated that a collective EU response to Lavrov's letter was forthcoming, coordinated with NATO. On February 10, the EU High Representative Josep Borrell sent a response on behalf of all 27 EU member states, offering to continue dialogue with Russia on ways to strengthen the security of all and asking Russia to de-escalate by withdrawing troops from around Ukraine. Reactions. Ukraine. In an interview with the French newspaper Libération in April 2021, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said that Russian troops build up on the northeast border with Ukraine, in Ukraine's eastern war zone, and in Crimea, and the deterioration of the situation in eastern Ukraine were the gravest since the attack on Ukrainian sailors in the Kerch Strait in November 2018. In November 2021, Kyrylo Budanov, the chief of Ukraine's military intelligence, said that Russia was preparing for an attack by the end of January or beginning of February 2022. On January 25, 2022, Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov said he saw no immediate threat of a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. He insisted that the threat had not significantly increased in 8 years as the Russian army had not formed a strike group that would be able to carry out an invasion. On January 28, 2022, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called on the West not to create a panic in his country over a potential Russian invasion, adding that constant warnings of an imminent threat of invasion were putting the economy of Ukraine at risk. Zelensky said that we do not see a bigger escalation than in early 2021 when Russian military build-up started. On February 2, the U.S. White House said it would no longer describe a potential invasion as imminent. On February 12, 2022, Zelensky said of the White House's warnings about the imminent threat of the Russian invasion that the best friend of our enemies is panic in our country. And all this information only causes panic and does not help us. David Arakamiya, the head of the faction of Zelensky's Servant of the People Party in the Verkhovna Rada, said the constant warnings of a possible imminent Russian invasion of Ukraine costs the country $23 billion every month. On February 19, 2022, speaking at the Munich Security Conference 2022, Volodymyr Zelensky criticized the policy of appeasement towards Russia and called on the Western countries to help. He also said that Ukraine would not respond to provocations by the Russian-led militants in Donbass, following the escalation and death of 2 Ukrainian soldiers. On February 22, 2022, Zelensky said he will consider severing Ukraine's diplomatic relations with Russia. Russia. Despite the Russian military build UPS, Russian officials over months repeatedly denied that Russia had plans to invade Ukraine. In mid-November 2021, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that it was alarmist to consider that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine. On November 27, Sergei Naryshkin, director of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, addressed allegations of plans to invade Ukraine by stating, "I need to reassure everyone. Nothing like this is going to happen," and blaming malicious propaganda by the U.S. State Department for the situation. On November 28, Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for Putin, stated that Russia has never hatched, is not hatching and will never hatch any plans to attack anyone. Russia is a peaceful country. On November 30, Putin stated that an expansion of NATO's presence in Ukraine, especially the deployment of any long-range missiles capable of striking Russian cities or missile defense systems similar to those in Romania and Poland, would be a red line issue for Russia. On January 19, 2022, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said that Russia does not want and will not take any action of aggressive character. "We will not attack, strike, invade, whatever Ukraine." In late January 2022, Nikolai Zuroflev, Vice Speaker of the Federation Council, warned that Europe would not receive natural gas, petroleum, and metals from Russia in the event that Russia was disconnected from the SWIFT international payment system. Moreover, such a move could not be feasible as it would require consent of all the countries participating in this system. Also in late January 2022, Nikolai Patrushev, Secretary of Russia's Security Council, said that the idea that Russia is threatening Ukraine was absolutely ridiculous and added, "We don't want war. We don't need that at all." Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Alexander Grushko, condemned the deployment of NATO troops, warships, and fighter jets in Eastern Europe, saying that the military alliance was demonizing Russia in order to justify military activity on eastern flank. Russia accused Ukraine of not implementing Minsk agreements reached in 2015 with the aim of establishing peace in Donbass. On February 7, 2022, Putin said at a joint press conference with French President Emmanuel Macron, "A number of ideas, proposals are possible as a basis for further steps. We will do everything to find compromises that suit everyone." On February 12, 2022, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov accused the United States and its allies of waging a propaganda campaign about Russian invasion of Ukraine. He described Western demands to remove Russian troops from Russian territory as regrettable. On February 11, 2022, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu met UK Defense Secretary Ben Wallace. Shoigu denied that Russia was planning an invasion of Ukraine. Wallace agreed at the meeting, which also included General Valery Gerasimov, that it was important to implement the Minsk agreements as a clear way forward. On February 20, Russia's ambassador to the U.S., Anatoly Antonov, said that Russian forces don't threaten anyone. There is no invasion. There is no such plans. On February 21, President Putin signed a decree recognizing the two self-proclaimed separatist republics in Donbass as independent states. NATO became a flashpoint in the Russo-Ukrainian crisis. The Russian government demanded that NATO stop admitting any new members, and strongly opposed the potential accession to NATO of Georgia or Ukraine. As of 2022, Ukraine is not a NATO member, but affirmed its goal of eventually joining NATO. Ukraine participates in NATO's Partnership for Peace program, including the annual Sea Breeze and Rapid Trident military exercises. NATO repeatedly called upon Russia to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and has condemned Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea and the Russia-backed separatists in eastern Donbass, calling for a resolution to the Donbass conflict via the Minsk agreements. In December 2021, as Russia continued a military buildup on Ukraine's borders, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly met with Ukrainian leaders to reaffirm the alliance's support for Ukraine, to call upon NATO members to enhance delivery of defensive weapon systems to Ukraine, and to counter Russian disinformation. NATO indicated it would not defend Ukraine if Russia attacked it. Talks in January 2022 between the US and Russia impassed over Russia's demand. The lead Russian negotiator, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, said that it was absolutely mandatory that Ukraine never, ever join NATO. By contrast, NATO and the US have affirmed NATO's open door policy, maintaining that countries should freely choose whether to join NATO or not. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said that, "No one else has the right to try to veto or interfere in that process. And this is about fundamental principles for European security. It's about the right for every nation to choose their own path." During the crisis, Stoltenberg urged Russia to turn away from belligerency, participate in diplomatic talks, and cooperate with NATO. In a January 2021 interview, reaffirmed NATO's dual-track approach to Russia, saying, "We are ready to engage in dialogue with Russia, but we will never compromise on core principles for European security. Russia has a choice to either engage in dialogue with NATO and Western allies or choose confrontation. We need to be clear-eyed about the prospect that Russia will once again use military force against Ukraine. We will provide support to Ukraine to enable them to strengthen their ability to defend themselves." Spanish Foreign Minister José Manuel Alvarez stated that Spain wanted dialogue, but if does not bear fruit, of course, Spain will stand with its European partners and its NATO allies united in deterrence. On January 24, NATO announced it would send additional military forces to its eastern members. Due to the deteriorating security situation, NATO will continue to take all necessary measures to protect and defend all allies, including by reinforcing the eastern part of the alliance. Deployments included 4 Danish F-16 fighter jets being sent to Lithuania, in addition to a frigate traveling to the Baltic Sea. 2 Dutch F-35 fighter jets will also be deployed to Bulgaria. The Chief of Staff of the Belgian Army also stated that the country was ready to send more forces to NATO's eastern allies. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Alexander Grushko, condemned the deployments, saying that the military alliance was demonizing Russia in order to justify military activity on eastern flank.